The Sleight of Mouth model was initially developed by Robert Dilts in the field of Neuro-Linguistic Programming and later popularized by Doug O'Brien, and in the recent breakdowns on my channel I have used my simplified version of that model, but since many people have been introduced to that field through the brilliant work of Robert Dilts, I wanted to use again for once the actual old model, which received as a critic that it was a bit too complicated, with too many steps and too many categories. So to simplify that in the context of a debate, because debates these days are getting more and more popular and the population is getting more and more divided, how can you use that model and all those categories to become a better debater, or at least defend your ideas with more cleverness rather than aggressiveness? So we are going to divide this into 5 different steps, and the first 3 will be more geared toward developing your worldview and your argumentation, and then the steps 4 and 5 will be about how do you defend that against somebody else in a live action debate or in some heated conversation. The very first step, I think, is the most relevant among all of those things, is to better define what is called here your model of the world, or if you prefer, your worldview. Where do your perceptions come from? It is very important, and even more than you think, because quite often, if not most of the time, people just pick arguments that they like. They look at some high school graph about how a curve is going this way, and that is all they need to prove that they are right. About economics, about gender, about anything, about marriage, whatever they debate, they just use single arguments without actually studying where does that ideology comes from. If they want to be right-wing or left-wing or whatever they want to be, where does that come from in the beginning? Before looking at some specific facts, go back to where it comes from, which is linked in this model to chunking up. Just to take one statement, one thing you stand for in a debate, one idea or value you would like to defend in front of others. I support this, I stand for that, and chunk it up. Which category is this belonging to in the modern worldviews we can see out there? Because as of today, basically anyone from the right that you don't like is a Nazi, and anyone from the left you don't like is a woke libtard. But when you really dig deeper into what a Nazi is and what a woke is, it's way more complicated than just I don't like this person, therefore they are this. Evaluate what is the deeper worldview behind that, and as much as possible, avoid using only your personal experiences to justify what you know is the truth. I know it's right because I have seen it. That's not a valid argument. First of all, where does that come from in a bigger perspective? Does it come from religion? Does it come from a political ideology? In which case, when did that ideology start historically? Who were the first founding people who preached for that ideology? If you are a communist, have you at least read the Communist Manifesto? If you are a capitalist, do you even understand what the libertarian movement is, how it started, who were the first persons, the first people to portray those values? Can you just enlarge your worldview to more important facts than your personal feelings of the day alone? Next, we have the opening statement. Once you have clarified what your worldview is and why do you support this, why do you stand for that, then we can get into the first argument of the debate, or preparing at least what you are going to say if it is your job to debate, or if you are expecting some people will annoy you at some point on this topic you have some preferences upon, then what kind of argument will be stronger from the beginning to avoid falling into the traps your opponents might try to get you stuck with. The cause and effect statement is basically what is known in rhetoric as the inference, or the premise and the conclusion. What does lead to what else? And the critical point here is to only use the cause and effect statements that will be the most difficult to argue against for your opponent, or for anyone who has the opposite ideology to the one you have. Some arguments are pretty easy to debunk, some arguments are quite difficult to debunk. For example, if I want to talk about capitalism and I noticed there were indeed some bad people who are rich in the world. I also noticed there were great economic innovations because of capitalism sometimes. So if I want to defend that, and I use, for example, the argument, oh, under capitalism you can become rich, that is a terrible argument. So capitalism, the premise, causes people to become rich. That is a terrible inference because we can see way too many people who are still broke, even under capitalism, and who struggle financially. But if I hadn't properly studied my topic, I might be dumb enough to attack with this. However, if I have studied economics slightly more, and then I am against a far left person, not just left wing, but really far left stubborn person, somebody who doesn't just want to tax the rich, but really want to kill all of them because they are evil, and I have had to handle many guys like this in the past, and one thing I found to be more difficult for them to argue against was, okay, let's say we kill all the rich. That's fine, we kill all of them because capitalism is evil, we have to destroy all of the rich. Fine. How specifically do you expect the government to get money inside their pocket? How do you want the government to fund their projects if we remove absolutely all of the money that the rich people pay in taxes? I am aware that some people who are rich don't pay their taxes or not as much as they should. I also know some of them are paying all the things they have to pay. If we kill all of them, if we remove all of them, how do you expect the government to fund whatever they have to fund? And that statement is just an opening statement. It is not in any way something that could shut down anybody, definitely not. But it is an argument more difficult to refute or to attack than, oh, capitalism is good because you can become rich. That is terrible. However, using that, I noticed, at least in my personal experience on this one, when people who are just far left like this, impossible to debunk the idea that not everything they see in the media is always true and not everything is always evil, this one at least was making them struggle much more to defend their position. Quite often because they were only studying the facts that were in favor of their ideology and not anything that could disprove their arguments. When you study both sides, then you know where the opposing side is really, really weak. And far left, in my experience, are weaker in terms of specifically how economics works on a deeper level. They are usually only aware of what they want to be the truth, not how it works in terms of budget allocations from the government's pockets. Step number 3, before getting into serious argumentation, will be in conjunction with the development of your worldview to develop better consequences. If you want to convince anyone that your worldview, that what you preach, what you stand for is more beneficial for society or is more valuable than what your opponent says, then what kind of positive consequences do you expect if everyone was agreeing with you? Let's say you don't have to debate anymore, the age of debating in 2030 or whatever is over because everyone has finally granted that you were right about everything. Then what? What do you think is a positive change that might happen in the world? When challenged with those questions, usually you are going to unveil that some of the things you were defending actually only related to you personally and not to the world around. So if you try to debate only in a selfish way because you want this to be true, but you don't really care about people around you, that is going to be a serious weak point in your argumentation that your opponents will point out if they are serious about the topic. They will spot that in a minute. So can you attach what you stand for to broader positive consequences for everyone, not just you yourself in your tiny selfish world, but everyone around? How can you prove that joining your worldview, your ideology would be beneficial to at least most people around you, not just yourself? And with all of that built up, then we are ready to get into more serious argumentation, which is where this model was conceptualized. How do you bounce back and forth between statements? Because whatever you have to say, the person in front of you will have a counter rebuttal, some counter argument, and they will try to prove you wrong because you are an idiot and they are smart, at least in their perception. And you might think the same about them. If you try to think about them in a degrading way, they will do the same with you. The world is a mirror. Big news. So in argumentation, I would avoid, from experience, I would seriously avoid to jump too fast into redefining what they do, also called as ad hominem attacks, because that person is right-wing and I don't like it, they are a Nazi. Okay, maybe be careful with those terms, especially if you don't master the actual context in which those terms were invented. Same thing with, oh, you're just a woke lefty. If you're not super aware of how wokeism has been invented and how it was developed, not to say one or the other is false or wrong, just avoid using those terms, especially if the person in front of you did not use them first. So avoid translating what they say with a terminology that they did not use first. You may add nuance, as we're going to see here, but avoid smuggling in the conversation terms they haven't used first. And the other one I would avoid is to use counterexamples too fast before really figuring out what their worldview is made of. Counterexamples, if you don't realize that this person might have a way deeper background than you have on the topic, you're just battling against the wall. But the point of a debate is still, despite all of that attempt to maintain things in a polite way, the point of a debate is still to prevent the other person from moving too many pieces on the chessboard. If it is a real debate, you want to get them stuck where they are and solely relying upon other counterexamples like, yeah, but what about this one? And what about this thing? And what about that about Christianity? What about this about socialism? Maybe before bringing counterexamples, aim more at demystifying, debunking the arguments they made. Before bringing into the conversation something else that they haven't even mentioned, first confuse or debunk what they claimed to be true. In that regard, I think one of the best patterns on that chart is a change of frame size. This means basically adding nuance, therefore, on which part of the population, for example, are we referring to when we say that those people are oppressed? Okay, for example, which part of the population, what country are we talking about? Or also which part of history are we referring to? When you say this is wrong, this is bad because I saw that happening, when specifically did you see that happening? Does that relate to every other part of history, including the last century, including the last 10 years? Maybe it is the case, but just clarification. Which specific part are you talking about? Because it might be the easiest way to debunk one statement by broadening the scope of attention, by enlarging the frame, basically, to other contexts in which what they say is not completely true. And the other one, still into argumentation, you can use the meta frame to avoid the person to assume too much authority over the conversation by asking, okay, you think those things are great, that we should do this and that, by which authority do you judge that? In which position of authority do you think you are to say that this is more relevant, that we should as human beings act like that we should do this? By which authority do you presume to know the truth about all of that? And how did we define who could be in charge of that? Because, for example, if you want to kill the government because they are bad people, then who do you want to put instead of them? Because, for example, one of my personal worldviews is that from human nature, whoever we put at the top of a huge empire at some point will abuse their power. My personal belief, I'm not saying I'm right in every example, it is just something I came up with by studying how society works and a bit of history. So my challenge on the meta frame might be, okay, you say those people who run right now the government, they are bad people, not even in the US, like anywhere. They are bad people. Fine, they are bad people. Then who do you think should be in charge? Okay, those people should be in charge. How do you have the proof that the people you would like to be in charge won't do other bad things? What's your evidence? And whatever evidence they use, we can also challenge their evidence in turn, again, by changing the frame size. For example, you use that one example to say that, oh, if my favorite politician was in charge, everything would go fine. We can pinpoint examples in history, broadening the frame size again. In history, there has been people from the political spectrum you talk about, including from the one I talk about, who have been scamming people who did bad things. So reality and truth is always way more complicated than any political agenda tries to portray it. By using the meta frame, taking on a higher perspective, you can comment on the fact that their argument is not completely validated. And if you know a bit more about logic and about rhetoric, or like the Socratic method, you might even get into commenting on how did they make their assumption. I can see that you presume that cause leads to that conclusion, which is not verified. Those are logical links and a bit more advanced, but that is something to have in your toolbox in the same way. Finally, step number 5, which might never happen and which almost never happens these days because it requires to have good faith debaters, which is less and less common. At least some of the people from both the left wing and the right wing still try, we can see that, they still try to maintain open conversations. I would say the ones who do it properly are doing a fantastic job, at least of trying to get people to talk more intelligently instead of just insulting each other. And at the end of a debate like this, you might use the another outcome and hierarchy of criteria. Basically, can we agree together on what do we think is a more urgent thing to resolve? And is there a possibility from all the things you and I have said to gather our resources together so that we can accomplish that more urgent goal in society? Would it be possible? Is there some compromise we could make? Ultimately, a good faith debate will try to find compromises. Some people just don't try to find any because they are stubborn, they are like this, whatever. But if you come in a debate with the presupposition you can learn something interesting from the people in front of you, then eventually you get at this last phase where you try to find common ground. Where can we put our resources together so that we get toward a society we would like to see? That is way more complicated, obviously, and most people never get there because they are just stuck on the emotional side of I don't like this, therefore it is wrong. Yeah, sometimes you may also need to get a bit more advanced in your study of how facts are happening right now around you in the world. That is always more complicated. But at the same time, if you enjoyed this video, there is a chapter down below coming from my book that you can read right now for free, for a limited time only. It is a deeper study on how debating works on a semantic level and how can you use the semantics or language to prove somebody wrong or find a compromise depending on what you want to accomplish. I'm not your dad, so if you want to use that stuff to fuck people over, the karma is on you, not on me. Do whatever you want. I encourage positive uses of those technologies. And then I hope people can communicate in at least a better way than they have been so far. If it is possible, I don't know. I will see. I will tell you in 10 years if it has worked or not. Maybe yes, maybe no. In any case, you have this chapter down below. Be my guest if you want to read that on debating and proper methodology to create a good argument from scratch. And with that in mind, thanks a lot for watching. See you soon in the next video.